I just want to acknowledge that this presentation was recorded on Crow, Shoshone, Nez Perce, Blackfoot, Flathead, and Lakota lands. In director John Ford's The Searchers, there is a famous shot of the character Ethan Edwards as he reacts to a white woman whose captivity by the Comanche has allegedly driven her insane. To emphasize its importance, the camera dollies up to this character, played by John Wayne, and lingers on his face as he cycles through a series of troubled and troubling reactions. As philosopher Robert Pippin has argued, the Wayne character responds to this madwoman not simply in hatred, but rather with a series of complex emotions, including anger, sadness, self hatred, and moral confusion. I would add that this shot also portrays Edwards as seeing the woman as a powerfully disgusting but pitiable object of compassion. By means of this cascade of sentiments and perhaps a touch of shame that seems to momentarily flash across Wayne's face, The Searchers raises the possibility that the complex and contradictory nature of all these different emotions might be worth contemplating. Because Ford has allowed the camera to linger on this character's face, viewers are clearly meant to discern them. This shot thus reveals elements that are pivotal to the film's intended narrative impact, and various discussions in the critical literature reflect the fact that the shot has successfully done its work. Essays such as Pippin's illustrate how this film evokes realizations in thoughtful viewers that American attitudes towards race in general, and Native Americans in particular, are not simple, straightforward, and clear, but rather frustratingly complex, inconsistent, and difficult to disentangle. Furthermore, such essays underscore that the possibility for reflection that the Wayne character quickly brushes aside needs to be taken seriously. Additionally, the emotional complexity of this shot raises questions concerning implicit racial bias, because viewer reactions manifest responses that are in no way sufficiently explained by justified true belief models. The idea that implicit attitudes and embodied affect play some role cries out for investigation. In pursuing this possibility, I will first introduce the idea of white racialized disgust, then explore what this idea means affectively and cinematically regarding the portrayal of Native Americans in classic Hollywood westerns. As I have argued elsewhere, white racialized disgust is one of the main forms through which many affective responses concerning race have been channeled for much of Hollywood's history. This form of disgust dominated many standard presentations of non white characters for decades and continues to exert considerable influence. It is a form of moral revulsion that many whites have traditionally felt toward ideas of racial intermarriage, sharing drinking fountains with people of color, and other forms of race mixing. It can be seen as having been manifested in perhaps its most extreme form in contemporary white moviegoers' reactions to the character Gus in The Birth of a Nation. Consistent with widespread beliefs about race at the time, most white viewers were appalled and at times explicitly disgusted by this black character's lustful appetites for a young white girl. White racialized disgust also helps us to understand Ethan's cascade of emotions. He feels revulsion at the former captive's allegedly contaminated association with the Comanche and responds accordingly with a sense of angry loathing before cycling through associated emotions of sadness, self hatred, and so on. Such racialized responses of disgust were pervasive among whites for a long time in the U.S. and arguably underlay much of the institutionalization of segregation, assimilation, westward expansion, and similar policies from the 19th and into the 20th centuries. Thus, it seems reasonable to infer that whole generations of white people grew up and were enculturated into societies where such adverse reactions were typically manifested in automatized disgust responses. Trained and habituated into many individuals were attitudes, predispositions, and action tendencies that encoded white supremacy into automatic, embodied reactions well below the level of conscious thought. It is further worth noting that the stock depiction of Native American characters in many classic Westerns aimed at eliciting such white racialized disgust in order to manifest a distinct lack of sympathy and readiness to see violence or revenge wreaked upon them. In Howard Hawks' Red River, for example, Native Americans enter into the narrative as screaming, quote, savage, end quote, antagonists who communicate with each other by means of animal sounds, inexplicably ambush white settlers, and attack and burn wagons full of allegedly blameless pioneers looking for a better life. Native Americans also wantonly kill white women, slaughter good cattle, and steal family jewelry, thereby flaunting additional typical white audience social norms. In the early part of this film, Native Americans are additionally foreshadowed as a threatening, unseen presence, liable to mount unprovoked, vicious assaults at any moment. Similarly, in Stagecoach, when the Apache are finally visually introduced into the story, they are wordless and unsmiling, with guns poised at the ready, all the better to ambush the stagecoach full of mostly sympathetic white characters traveling through the valley below. Moreover, these Native American characters have been foreshadowed as not only figures to be feared, but as morally disgusting. For by this point we have heard that they have, quote, burned every ranch building in sight, end quote, seen that they kill white women, and are led by, quote, that old Apache butcher Geronimo, end quote, as the alcoholic doctor played by Thomas Mitchell describes him. The Apache characters have been furthermore compared with vermin by different white characters, which adds an additional layer of moral disgust by association to the other adverse ways in which they have been portrayed. Thus, when audience members see them shot or injured in the film's final reels, they have been well prepared to feel little or no compassion and a certain amount of satisfaction that these narrative figures are receiving, quote, appropriate, end quote, treatment. In general, it seems clear that white racialized disgust can limit viewer imaginings of race characters to being outside the fully human and thereby make unsympathetic narrative fates for them much more palatable. In these and other ways, white racialized disgust provides an easily invoked pretext for cinematic violence against Native American characters. Of course, not all forms of white racialized disgust are as extreme as those just described. More muted versions are commonplace as well, especially in the form of disgusting comic relief. Laughter and amused responses evince perhaps milder forms of revulsion toward non whites than did, say, Gus in The Birth of a Nation. Nonetheless, it is important to underscore that these reactions remain rooted in white racialized disgust, as that is the source of their humor. In Red River, for example, Native Americans are such a source of disgusting humor as when the Cherokee character Quo wins half interest in Nadine Groot's false teeth during a poker game. Quo then perversely insists on holding these teeth until Groot can pay him off and renames himself Two Jaw Quo. As the movie points out, however, Quo has no need for these dentures, for in contrast to Groot, he has a full set of strong natural teeth. Yet for the rest of the movie, Quo only lends out Groot's teeth in order for him to eat and returns them to a vest pocket once Groot is finished. a sense of adverse violation concerning standard white social or moral norms, whether through violence, comedy, or other means, thus portrays Native American characters in many Hollywood westerns as disgusting, for such acts distance them from the audience, places them outside the fully human, and renders them morally repellent. Such depictions guide as well as limit viewer imaginative possibilities for Native American characters. Consequently, when these films present unsympathetic narrative fates for them, those fates are much more satisfying and in many cases even pleasurable for viewers. Points I take to be elaborations on ones made by Carl Plantinga in his book Moving Viewers. These illustrations also point to a certain refinement of technique in terms of characterizing Native Americans that took place in the classic Hollywood Western. After the advent of sound and during the Western's development stretching from the 1930s to the early 1960s, such characters became stock figures for eliciting disgust and revulsion, whereas earlier they had often been given more nuanced and individualized portrayals. As film scholars Angela Elise and Scott Simon both argue, the coming of sound was pivotal in how Native American characters were portrayed. As Simon describes it, while silent westerns frequently personalize such figures, quote, with the end of the silent film, Native Americans vanished from the genre as anything like individualized characters, end quote. In the majority of cases, they were either completely absent from the narrative or became characterized as an, quote, unindividuated horde, war whooping, seldom speaking, swooping down en masse from ominous hilltops, and then gunned down with godlike accuracy from long range in uncountable numbers. Simon notes that these westerns presumed a sense of manifest destiny, such as described by Theodore Roosevelt, and implicitly and at times even explicitly asserted, quote, democracy was carried forward by favored races with the skills and the blood to advance, end quote. As Simon documents, supported by the work of American cultural critic Richard Slotkin and others, this historical, quote, destiny, end quote, had a distinctly racialized Anglo Saxon flavor. As John Wayne's character in The Big Trail declares, quote, we're blazing a trail that started in England. We're building a nation, end quote. However, blazing that trail also meant eradicating the non pioneering, non English speaking occupants of the western United States who, consistent with Locke's idea that labor must be mixed with the land in order for it to be property, and that Native Americans had allegedly never done so, had to be removed or eliminated. Thus, finding a palatable way to, quote, justify, end quote, their eradication became paramount in cinematic narratives about why such Western expansion and dispossession was legitimate. However, one thing that Simon does not discuss that accompanied this change from the silence to sound was a sharpening of characterization concerning Native Americans so that they would more strongly elicit white racialized disgust. In addition to denying them individuated identities, the depersonalization of such characters through sound as well as visuals made them more repulsive. Foregrounded, as they often had been in the past, were ways in which Native American characters allegedly broke existing white socio-moral taboos that could be communicated visually, such as threateningly wielding tomahawks or galloping into the camera on horseback. But in addition, the advent of sound permitted filmmakers to more immediately trigger white racialized disgust by invoking war whoops, screams, animal calls, silences, unintelligible language, and brutal vocalizations, as well as permitting a more reliable use of music and sound effects to intensify or modulate any reactions the filmmakers aim to create visually. Collectively, these additional means of characterization through sound sharpen the overall adverse effect of Native American depictions so that they could more immediately and forcefully elicit an automatized disgust response. Of course, one objection to this interpretation I've presented so far is, what about all the seemingly sympathetic portrayals of Native Americans that also occurred in Hollywood westerns? During the classic era, there were films like Jim Thorpe All American, Apache, and Broken Arrow that sought to portray Native Americans in a positive light. There were also what Elise refers to as the surprising silence, filled with sympathetic portrayals of Native Americans that in some cases were made by and starred Native Americans themselves. Even the 1930 film in which John Wayne had his first starring role, The Big Trail, contained sympathetic portrayals of Native American characters in how the Wayne character describes them as his friends and some helpfully guide the wagon train central to the story. Clearly, there were divergent characterizations as well as positive reactions to Native Americans that need to be addressed as well. In response, I would argue that this dichotomous form of characterization is explained by the historical conception of the noble savage and is merely the flip side of what I'm arguing became a more sharply focused standard stock depiction after the advent of sound. Noting this dichotomy makes sense of the fact that white Americans' stance toward Native Americans has been schizophrenic, to use Simmons' term, since at least the colonial era. Moreover, as Elise documents, the Hollywood Western has evolved in cycles rather than developing in a consistent linear pattern, with more or less sympathetic portrayals of Native Americans ebbing and flowing depending on box office returns, national or political attitudes, artistic considerations, filmmakers' sentiments, and so on. Sometimes these sympathetic cycles took place at the same time as unsympathetic cycles, and sometimes movies would simultaneously include both, like The Big Trail. In cinematic terms, both the noble savage and the ignoble savage stereotypes amount to what Noel Carroll calls realistic heuristics that may be called upon to understand cinematic narrative and modulate viewer response. As Carroll describes this idea, by, quote, using what we believe about the actual world and how it works, end quote, we fill in gaps in the storytelling and, quote, make sense of what is on screen, end quote. In the case of cinematic depictions involving Native American characters, we have two different realistic heuristics at our disposal, and depending on which one filmmakers aim to elicit, different techniques are used and therefore different heuristics triggered. Certain realistic heuristics furthermore associate with diverging paradigm scenarios concerning our emotions that Westerns may call upon in order to modulate audience affective response. Carroll links realistic heuristic generally with our emotional reactions, and Plantinga argues more specifically that we learn as our experience of the emotions deepens, quote, types and sequences of events that are associated with certain emotions, end quote. Thus, certain stories become associated with particular emotions, such as fear and disgust with horror films, or more specifically with certain characters, such as the monster. In the case of classic Hollywood westerns, white racialized disgust became more acutely associated with the appearance of non-individuated, non-English speaking, warlike, and morally repulsive Native Americans sometime in the mid-1930s. In particular, this type of depiction and its accompanying sequences of likely events, such as raids, attacks, or ambushes, is what Plantinga has more recently called a, quote, narrative paradigm scenario, end quote, because certain story elements broadly define the emotions and the actions surrounding them. By the mid 1930s, such scenarios involving Native Americans became conventionalized and were regularly taken up by Hollywood westerns. For example, such scenarios are certainly evident in the movies analyzed above, as well as in John Ford's Cavalry trilogy and countless other westerns like Union Pacific and The Plainsman. Arguably, they continue to this day in films such as Bone Tomahawk, Hostiles, and The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. A further objection might be that the term realistic, in Carroll's conception of a realistic heuristic, is being stretched to the breaking point here. However, given the overwhelming support that racist beliefs and attitudes have had from scientific racism for over 150 years, and the ways in which they were embedded in standard histories, fictions, cultural presumptions, governmental policies, treaties, and so forth, it is not difficult to see why such ideas became presumed to be accurate as well as, quote, realistic, end quote, for many white Americans, and why they continue to be default heuristics and elements of standard narrative paradigm scenarios from which many white filmgoers continue to view Native American characters. Moreover, as philosopher Dan Kelly has argued, disgust is something that can persist quite powerfully even in the absence of reasons for it and has a quote dumbfounding end quote effect on our moral evaluative judgments, which would make such presumptions and predispositions extremely hard to change. What I have explored thus far are some of the theoretical elements of depiction involving Native Americans in classic Hollywood westerns, what they mean in terms of typical white audience reaction, and how these reactions connect to recent work in cognitive film theory. Now, I will briefly connect this exploration directly to recent implicit bias literature. If we take seriously philosopher Michael Brownstein's general account that implicit biases are, quote, evaluative thoughts and feelings about social groups that can contribute to discriminatory behavior even in the absence of explicitly prejudiced motivations, end quote, then stock depictions of Native Americans during Hollywood's classic period can tell us much about the subtleties through which racism works, both inside and outside the movie theater or TV room. Many viewers respond in racist ways towards cinematic Native American characters, even in the absence of explicitly racist beliefs or motivations, due to their implicit racial biases being triggered through story elements that elicit non conscious reactions of white racialized disgust. These depictions associate with narrative paradigm scenarios that are both affective and cinematic and have been evoked again and again by Westerns, as well as films that implicitly or explicitly reference them. Such elicitations sanction viewers' acquiescence and at times approval of various forms of unsympathetic treatment, so that violence, revenge, or even death might be wreaked upon Native American characters without qualm. These elicitations could potentially reinforce racist behavior at a non conscious level, even in the absence of explicitly prejudiced belief or motivation. Similar considerations could be extended mutatis mutandis regarding other racialized groups in Westerns, such as Mexicans or Chinese immigrants. So too could they be applied to other sorts of films, such as Zulu, the Star Wars series, or the Starship Trooper series, insofar as they mimic in relevant ways classic Hollywood Westerns. On a more positive note, the analysis proposed in this presentation also connects to a vast literature on disgust, embodied cognition, anti bias training, habit, fictional imagining, and a variety of other topics, thereby making available a whole matrix of adjunct theorizing for the purposes of devising strategies to counteract racism, both cinematic and real. For example, Brownstein argues, quote, it is by treating our implicit attitudes as if they were habits, packages of thought, feeling, and behavior that we can make them better. By realizing that white racialized disgust is akin to implicit racial bias, and that therefore it too might be treated in part as a bad habit, we might thereby find improved strategies to challenge as well as change it. Thank you.